All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining me and the PolicyLink housing team for part 2 of our webinar series about housing justice on the ballot. As you're joining the room, please introduce yourself in the chat. You can feel free to share your name, pronouns, where you're joining from, what organization that you're with. My name is Tram Hoang, and I'm a senior associate here at PolicyLink. I use she, her pronouns, and I am based in the Twin Cities on Dakota land. And I'm especially excited for today's webinar because our focus is near and dear to my heart. Prior to joining the PolicyLink team, I served as a campaign manager for the Keep St. Paul Home campaign that passed rent stabilization in Minnesota. And it's very special to me because I really admire the work of grassroots organizers and tenant organizers. And today we get to zero in on that role that they play as organizers in advancing the housing justice movement through the ballot. Over the past decade, we have seen the role of renters grow in our political landscape. And even though we have survived and are currently living through tumultuous events, right? Foreclosure crisis, recessions, a pandemic, record-setting inflation, the growth of private equity landlords, all of these things point towards a world in which renters hold less power. And yet we know that the strongest movements are born out of these moments. And so here we are, in a time where renters are seen as an important voting bloc, which is a huge win, where cities across the country have not just passed tenant protections, but have done so by building power with their neighbors through the ballot. And I especially want to thank our speakers who are joining us today because they are in the thick of it with Election Day taking place in just a few weeks. So please join me in showering them in gratitude and good vibes. Those of you who have worked on campaigns know that this is crunch time. So we especially appreciate them spending their time with us when they could very easily be out door knocking, phone banking, or just putting out general campaign fires. And next slide, please. Yes, good vibes in the chat. Thank you, Kevin. So in the next 90 minutes, we are going to cover the following topics. I'll be going over some of the ballot wins that we've seen in the past 2 years and what's at stake in this year's elections. Then we'll spend the bulk of our time with our incredible panelists from Pasadena and Denver. We'll do some Q&A, and then I'll close us out. And to all of our participants, please feel free to submit questions that you have using the Q&A function. Some will be answered by my colleagues, Jasmine and Rashida, in that Q&A box, and then some will be uplifted during the Q&A section of our panel. All right, next slide, please. So we know that there have been many amazing housing wins in the last decade, but for today's quick overview, I'm going to be focusing specifically on tenant protections and rent stabilization policies that have been passed through the ballot in the last 2 years. So in 2020, organizers in Boulder passed a no eviction without representation ordinance. Some cities refer to that as right to counsel ordinance, and they passed that with 59% of voter support, which is huge. This policy had a few components to it, including establishing the right to counsel program, which provides legal representation to tenants who are facing eviction, creating a position within the city to administer it. You know, that's really important, right? Implementation. Creating a tenant committee for oversight of implementation, collecting a fee from landlords to help administer the program, and providing rental assistance to tenants. So this is a really great policy. It centers two of the things that help most in assisting tenants fight an eviction: legal assistance that they would not have had otherwise, and in a courtroom where landlords are much more likely to have legal counsel, and money to pay the rent. If folks are newer to right to counsel policies, we'll have a resource popped into the chat where you can learn more. Next slide, please. 2020 was also the year that organizers in Portland, Maine passed rent stabilization. And this was passed by People First Portland. It's a project of the Maine DSA Electoral Committee, or the Democratic Socialists of America. And they won it with 58% of voter support. So another huge win. And the ordinance that they passed capped annual rent increases to inflation, or CPI, Consumer Price Index. It covers most housing units and requires that landlords give tenants 75 days notice in the event of a rent increase, which is a much more significant amount of time than we see a lot of renters getting. It also allowed rent increases of 5% when a unit is vacated, meaning that if a tenant moves out, the landlord can increase rent up to 5% before the next tenant moves in. And then this policy also created a rent board to hear tenant complaints and act as a mediator when necessary. And I just want to point out the importance of 58 and 59%, right? These are no accident. It's not like these won by a couple of votes. It wasn't just 50% plus one. They won by thousands. And that's really something that we have to hold close to our hearts, because when we consider that homeowners have much higher voter turnout than renters, we can safely assume that the popularity of these tenant protection policies was actually even higher than the 58 and 59% that we saw. Go to the next slide. So 2021 was a year of rent stabilization, especially if you lived in the Twin Cities. Both Minneapolis and St. Paul had rent stabilization in different forms. And that is because Minneapolis and St. Paul have different city charters, which prevents Minneapolis residents from being able to put a proposed ordinance directly on their ballot. And so the Minneapolis ballot question was placed on the ballot by their city council and the city charter commission. And residents were asked to vote on whether the city charter should be amended to give city council the power to enact rent stabilization in the future. So it was a little bit more vague. And it did pass with 54% of the vote, but the council has yet to pass a rent stabilization ordinance. Next slide, please. And St. Paul, however, is a different story. And, obviously I have strong connection with this campaign. I have my yard sign over here behind me. The St. Paul City Charter allows residents to put ordinances directly on the ballot, which is really powerful. And that's what happened in St. Paul. So our campaign mobilized renters and allies across the city. We collected over 9,000 signatures to get the strongest rent stabilization policy in the country on the ballot. And we won that with 53% of the vote. Despite an opposition spending $5 million trying to fight this, right? So amazing win. And the ordinance that was passed includes a 3% annual rent cap that applied to all units. So regardless of whether someone's renting a single family home or a duplex or living in a big multifamily apartment, it applied to all units with no vacancy decontrol and no new construction exemption. So no vacancy decontrol means that if you move out of your unit, the landlord cannot reset the rent to whatever amount they want before the next person moves in. And then no new construction exemption means that it doesn't matter whether you live in a 70-year-old building or a 5-year-old building, everyone deserves tenant protections, such as rent stabilization. And this got the support of 53% of voters, with the majority support coming from 6 out of the 7 wards in the city. And as you heard from, if you were able to attend last week's webinar, you heard from St. Paul City Council member Mitra Jalali, who shared with us that the council made significant amendments to the ordinance to weaken it. She was one of the 2 votes that voted against it, but those changes are going to take in effect January 2023. But the fight continues, and people are not giving up in St. Paul. We're still proud to say we're the only city in the Midwest to have rent stabilization, which we really hope changes soon as more and more of you run your own campaigns. And then, next slide, please. Of course, there is what's on the ballot this year coming up quick, Tuesday, November 8th. We have got some great news from across the country. First of all, Florida, a state that we did not expect, really progressive policy to be moving in because of its political landscape. It's really turning heads. So voters in Orange County, Florida, which is super exciting. That's the county in which Orlando is located. They're voting on a rent stabilization ordinance that would cap annual rent increases to inflation or CPI for 1 year. So sending a lot of support to the folks in Orange County. And then we also have voters in Santa Monica who are voting to improve their pre-existing rent control policy. So they already have a policy, but this year they're voting to strengthen it. Their current policy caps annual rent increases to 75% of CPI for units that are not exempt by the Costa-Hawkins Act of California. But this year, with inflation being so high, that number meant 6%, which community members decided was much too high. And so the question on the ballot this year in Santa Monica is, should the city update their policy to cap rents to a new number, which would be 75% of CPI, or 3%, whichever is lower? And Kind of a quick note to that, Oakland City Council made a very similar change to their rent control ordinance earlier this year because inflation was so high. So we're seeing even cities that already have rent stabilization making adjustments during these historic moments. And then, of course, Portland, Maine is in the mix again. It's only been 2 years since they passed rent control, and they're back to build upon its success. So Portland voters are going to be voting on question C, which would cap annual rent increases to 70% of CPI, improving on the policy they won, which was just capping at CPI. It would require 90 days notice of rent increases instead of 75. And they would also ban application fees and limit security deposit to 1 month's rent. And so these practices align with tenant protections that many cities are advancing to remove barriers within the tenant application and screening process. So you'll see that cities like Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis, they're all also passing policies that are attempting to remove some barriers to the tenant screening process. And then we have 2 more policies on the ballot this year, but we're going to save them to discuss with our panel. So before we move on to the panel, I want to drum up some excitement before we have our speakers join us. So I'm going to ask all of you to join me in a little activity called Chatterfall. All right, so Chatterfall is essentially where we create a waterfall effect in the chat with our answers to the same question. So I want everyone to think about this question, type your answer in the chat, but don't hit enter yet. And we'll all hit enter at the same time and see these answers trickle in, and we'll get to read them together. So the question is, what is a housing win that excites you? This could be a win in your community. It could be a win that you took part in, a win that you are just admiring because you read about from across the country. It could be something that we talked about today. What is a housing win that excites you? So I'll give folks about 2 minutes to think about it, type up their answer, and then I'll lead us in a countdown and we can all put our answer in the chat at the same time. Okay, 2 minutes. All right, got 1 more minute. Make sure to type your answer in the chat. Don't hit enter, and we'll do a little countdown soon. Okie doke. So hopefully everyone has their answer in the chat. And on 3, we can all hit enter and read each other's responses. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, that was somewhat overwhelming, which was the point. That was great. So together, let us scroll through and feel some excitement about all that's happening across the country. Wow, this is a lot more scrolling than I thought I'd have to do. This is great. Santa Clara, wonderful. Oh, Martine, that's a familiar face. Hey, Martine. Martine used to live in St. Paul. He was a part of our campaign. He's now in LA, so he's probably deep in the housing movement there as well. Statewide right to counsel in Washington, rent stabilization campaigns, expanding voter access. Yes, holding landlords accountable for the conditions of their buildings. new tenants. Yeah, getting new tenants involved is such a great win. Just cause protections. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing these wins in the chat. I hope that this is your kind of daily injection of positive feelings for the day and proof of all the amazing work that's happening across the country, even when it feels hard, right? Even when we click on news articles and feel a little down, there's so much amazing work happening. And this is kind of the perfect segue to introduce our speakers. And so now we finally get to what we've all been waiting for, our panel. So we have the joy of welcoming both Mitch Weldon and Ryan Bell to our webinar today. Both are wonderful humans and deeply committed organizers who are pouring their blood, sweat, and tears into campaigns in the cities that they call home. I'm going to let them share more about themselves, but first I'm going to share what's on the ballot in their respective cities so that we can focus on our discussion with like the meaty stuff. So Ryan Bell is a member organizer of the Pasadena Tenants Union in Pasadena, California, which worked to collect over 15,000 signatures to get Measure H on the ballot. And Measure H is the Pasadena Fair and Equitable Housing Charter Amendment. So what this charter amendment would do would cap annual rent increases to 75% of CPI or inflation in units that are not exempt by the Costa-Hawkins Act. And it would also pass just cause, meaning that landlords must list a valid reason when filing an eviction, such as breaking the lease or falling behind on rent. And this protects many people from evictions who are most vulnerable to them, especially people who are most vulnerable to discriminatory and retaliatory evictions, including low-income earners, Black and brown households, immigrant households, refugee households, and households with children. So this is like a double whammy on the ballot because you get both rent stabilization and just cause, which is like a really great pairing of policies. And we're also joined today by Mitch Weldon, who is a member organizer with No Eviction Without Representation Denver and the Denver Democratic Socialists of America chapter. Both groups that I just named organized to collect over 13,000 signatures to get initiated Ordinance 305 on the ballot, which, very similar to the policy that Boulder passed, would create a program to provide legal representation to tenants facing eviction, create a position in the city to administer the program, collect a landlord fee to pay for the program, create a tenants committee for oversight. And so as we have talked about, right to counsel programs like this work tremendously to reduce eviction rates when tenants are brought to court. And they also help to disincentivize eviction filings because landlords know that tenants will have their own legal counsel. So amazing policies being advanced between the two of these folks, and almost 30,000 signatures collected between these two groups, which is amazing. I mean, think about your work office. Can you even get 20 colleagues to sign a birthday card, right? 30,000 signatures, that's amazing. So let's get these slides down so that everyone can see our delightful speakers and their campaign swag. So, you know, we're gracing everyone with our beautiful graphic design. Let's get into the first question. So I'm gonna start with Mitch. Please tell us about yourself. Who are you and what role do you play in the Denver campaign?
Hey everyone, happy to be here. Thanks to Tram and the whole PolicyLink team for holding this event. Definitely fun to reflect on the campaign. And you know, it's been 2 years long, so I'm sure I've changed my mind on a number of these questions a few times, but hopefully gotten a little bit of experience here. Anyway, yeah, so my name's Mitch Weldon, use he, him pronouns, with the Yes on 305 or No Eviction Without Representation Denver campaign. I'm a volunteer organizer. I also serve on the steering committee we created earlier this year as part of, again, this ongoing process of, you know, a little bit of building it as we fly. But other than that, I came into this work through the Denver chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. Been kind of working on housing work for about going on almost 5 years now. And which kind of overlaps when I moved out here to Denver. So yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome, thank you. All right, Ryan, who are you and what role do you play in Measure H?
Yeah, this is getting existential right at the top. Like, who am I? What is it all worth? We are, I'm a tenant in Pasadena. My day job, I work as the Southern California Regional Organizer for Tenants Together, which is a statewide coalition of tenant organizations. Quite a few organizations that are multi-issue, but have a large component of their work related to tenant rights. And closer to home, I'm a member organizer with the Pasadena Tenants Union, which is about 5.5 years old. I got involved really like just a few months after the Tenants Union formed, when I received a no-fault eviction for my apartment. At the time, there were no eviction protections in Pasadena at all. So it was just 60 days without any explanation. And so I started looking to get back involved in the housing justice movement, which I had been in for years in Los Angeles. And that's how I got re-involved in specifically in tenant rights in this go around. And we've been working on this particular ballot measure for about 5 years. We had one failed attempt to get on the ballot, didn't get enough signatures. And then this last attempt has been about 18 months, I would say.
18 months, that's a long time.
Yeah, it's been like with a few exceptions, every weekend, for 1.5 years. And of course, days in between. And just when you think it couldn't be more challenging, it gets more challenging. So
yeah,
I wish the election were tomorrow.
But there are more voters to reach.
That's true.
So, now that we know a little bit about you, I'd love to hear more about your pathway to the ballot. So this is kind of a big question. We'll start with Ryan this time, but why the policies that you chose and why the ballot, right? Sometimes that's like a legal question. Sometimes that's like the pathway that you chose.
Yeah.
And what did it take to get on the ballot? I know you mentioned petition signatures, but just a little bit more.
Right. Yeah. So, the fight for rent control goes back some 20 years here in Pasadena, a good dozen years before I moved here, where it was an effort to convince city council to pass rent control and some eviction protections. There's never been any appetite whatsoever in Pasadena. We now have one city council member who's very new to the council who supports Measure H, and that's it out of 8 council members. So pretty early on, folks decided that it would need to be a ballot measure. If you know anything about California politics, we tend to love our ballot measures. Usually we get like a 200-page voter guide that has all this stuff in it, trying to sort through all the ballot measures. In 2017, we started this campaign. And at the time, it was not a charter amendment. It was an ordinance. And we needed 10% of the registered voters in Pasadena to sign the petition. We fell short by some 3,000 signatures. And so we went back to the drawing board, built out a stronger coalition, including more partners from the community and from the wider LA County community, and went at it again. There were some revisions made to the measure, most notably that we went this time for a charter amendment, which instead of 10% required 15% of registered voters. So we figured since we failed the first time, why not make it harder? So we did that, and COVID intervened, of course, slowed everything down. And we started in 2021 gathering signatures. And real transparency here, I don't usually talk about this part, but we had a couple of false starts. At one point, we just realized we weren't gathering signatures on a pace that was going to get us to our goal. We have 6 months. It's a clock that starts. And if you don't gather enough signatures by the deadline, you don't get to move forward. So we started over, brought in some additional resources, some expert folks that had passed ballot initiatives in California previously. And essentially their job was to give us a weekly whipping, into shape, to go back out and gather more signatures. So this time we overshot. We intended to get 15% more than we needed. We got about 13% more than we needed. So we ended up with over 20,000 signatures, 15,100 of them that were valid. And I like to point out that 20,000 number because a lot of people that rent their housing don't have a right to vote due to their immigration status or their residency or citizenship status. But they still have to pay rent to live in the community, and they still have to put up with some of the abusive practices that we see. So we got 15,000 valid signatures, but there were probably at least 18 or 19,000 that were other people that live here that would vote if they could. So it was an enormous challenge. It involved standing long hours in front of grocery stores, going door to door, and really have gotten to know the streets of our city quite well in the last couple of years.
Thanks, Ryan.
Pause there, yeah.
And Mitch, how about your journey to the ballot?
Yeah, it's also been a long one. There's kind of two sides to it. First was some of the tenant work that we had been doing here in Denver, again, as part of, that mostly came out of the Denver chapter of Democratic Socialists of America. And we were doing direct outreach to tenants facing eviction. We'd go down to the court, pull the summonses from the clerk. They're not posted online, but they're publicly available. The clerks at the courthouse didn't like us too much because we were asking for all these cases and all this paperwork. But that had the addresses of the tenants. So we'd go find the tenants who were about to face eviction, try to reach out to them, see what they were going through, collect information about their conditions they were experiencing as tenants, and also try to put them in touch with the rental and legal resources that did exist in the city. Definitely, it was good work, but also definitely, frankly, the mass amount of evictions we were seeing in Denver greatly outpaced our ability to make a dent through that work. So we pretty quickly realized the need for more structural changes. Through that work, we did start doing some tenant organizing at a complex here, and that unfortunately lost a lot of momentum at the start of the pandemic, right as we were about to accelerate and escalate the campaign. But that did offer us an opportunity to do some additional outreach to tenants, given the COVID eviction protections, with the CARES Act. And that kind of gets us to November 2020, which is when Boulder, just 45 minutes up the road from us, passed their Right to Counsel initiative. We had been in touch with that campaign for a good amount of time. We were hoping to help them collect signatures, but the pandemic hit. They powered through and made the ballot. And again, as y'all saw earlier, won pretty convincingly in a city that's more homeowner, even a greater percentage of homeowners than Denver is. So at that moment, they pushed us to run it down here. And again, we were looking for a way to make a structural change in the eviction process. So Right to Counsel came up as just a really a logical policy for us to pursue. I think for folks who haven't taken a look, please do take a look at the results from Right to Counsel policies enacted throughout this country. Really fantastic results in terms of the amount that when tenants get representation, they win such a greater percentage of their cases. So we didn't go necessarily into this thinking, Right to Counsel is what we necessarily want to do. Like I said, we were doing some tenant organizing or whatnot, but really the political opportunity presented itself to run with it here in Denver. So spring, around March 2021 is when we were able to file with the city our ordinance. Pretty similar ordinance to Boulder's. We actually both work with the same housing attorney who helped draft the ordinance language. So pretty similarly structured. Some of it also has to do with some specificities of Colorado law and ballot initiatives. So don't need to get into those details, but yeah, and then we had similar to Pasadena, we had 6 months, and the total number of valid signatures was around 9,250. It was quite the haul. We were able to do it. We originally were hoping to submit earlier and make the 2021 deadline, nice and tidy 1-year campaign, but that was, we realized pretty quickly that was pretty unfeasible. So we turned it in right at the deadline, and we turned in about 15,000 signatures, and something like 9,500 were valid. So we squeaked in, and we got some really timely help from a number of our partners to help us get on the ballot. So that sort of brings us to today. I mean, the last year has been switching to an electoral campaign. Kind of interesting having to first learn how to gather signatures, get that efficient machine running, and then to switch to something completely different for the last year. So there's definitely a learning process, and I think it was Tram who said, things just kind of continue to ratchet up forward. Now we're just a couple weeks out, doing as much voter outreach and contact as we can.
Thank you both so much. And in case folks are listening and they're like, why are so many of these signatures not valid? It's definitely a structural issue, right? I think that our secretaries of state and our governments make it difficult for residents to put things on the ballot. So I can speak from experience in St. Paul that our petition, and I have copies of it laying around here, it requires extremely specific ways of writing down things. So the name that you write down on your petition has to be the same name that you are registered to vote under. So for example, if your name is Nicholas and you registered to vote under Nick, but you wrote down Nicholas in your petition, that voids your signature. If you haven't updated your voter registration, that voids your signature. It asks for the year of your birth, but we're not really used to writing down our year of birth. And so many people just write down like month, dash, day, dash, year. That also invalidates the signature. So this is why campaigns work so hard to essentially double, right, when possible, the number of signatures they have to collect, because it's always, for some reason, it's always getting harder for us to make our signatures count. So I want to move on to the next question, which was something that you both kind of touched upon, right? There's like a different skill set that is required for collecting signatures and running an electoral campaign. And I think that when I talk to some organizers who are very used to like tenant organizing, they think, well, I'm not an electoral organizer. And so can you, and this time we'll start with Mitch, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between like your current ballot initiative work and tenant organizing or base building work?
Yeah, I love this question. I think it gets to some of the tensions I felt with this work, and definitely, again, getting to maybe ways I would restructure things in the future. But again, coming from where we were in terms of direct outreach to tenants, and it was we had done some direct tenant organizing work in a limited capacity at one complex, but some of the work that we were doing, I would have qualified more on an activist versus base building route in terms of the ways we were structuring, people who were reaching out to and asking them to join in our efforts. That was particularly true when we were reaching out to doing the direct outreach to folks facing eviction. So when we started the campaign, it was really a group of volunteer members of a political organization, starting it and coming at it from that angle instead of from like a grassroots or large base tenant organization. Now we've kind of sort of flipped the relationship, and that I think what a lot of our work has done has opened a lot of runway, to use a weird term, but a runway for building on this and starting to build towards more of a tenants movement here in Denver. Particularly some of our outreach, particularly doing a lot of outreach to established community organizations in, particularly renter-heavy, Black and brown parts of Denver that are at the front lines of gentrification and resisting gentrification. Through this campaign, we've been able to start to build those relationships that will hopefully offer a solid base for building a strong housing movement in Denver, because Denver has historically, besides some tenant union activity in the 70s and 80s, which is now almost 50 years ago, it's lacked sort of any sort of citywide member-based organizations that are identify as tenants and are working around tenant issues. So there, I guess I'll leave it there. And the other thing I'll say is, one thing that we have been doing right now, doing direct voter outreach at the doors, is building into our scripts and the data that we're collecting, not just, hey, how are you going to vote on this issue, is, are you a renter? Are you facing any issues as a renter? And if you are facing issues, do you want to, or even if you're not, do you want to connect after this election about tenant union work and tenant organizing, so that we can begin to build like a sustainable tenants movement here in the city. And I guess I'll end by saying, not only have been building bridges with different community organizations within the city, but there's also a number of statewide organizations that have been pretty instrumental in helping us, who have done some, I'm thinking particularly 9 to 5 Colorado, which is mostly Latina organization advocating for a variety of issues, but particularly done some fantastic work organizing mobile home residents. And we've passed a number of, at the state level, a number of mobile home protections over the past few years. So they've been instrumental in helping us get to the ballot, and also are helping us reach voters today. So those relationships that we've built with not just organizations in the city, but statewide, have really helped to start to, I think, cohere something that we're hoping lasts long beyond just a single campaign.
Awesome, thanks. And you, Ryan? Oh, sorry, can you start over? I wasn't able to hear you for the first few seconds.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was just saying that this question is a huge tension that all of us in the campaign have wrestled with. We started, we sometimes say, like, did the first rent control ballot initiative campaign launch the tenants union, or did the tenants union launch the ballot initiative campaign? I wasn't there for those early decisions in like 2017, but either way, the tenant union has grown incredibly since those days. We have, over close to 800 people on our mailing list, and now, I remember in the early days of the signature gathering, we started this spreadsheet on Google Sheets. That was, the title of the spreadsheet was something like "Everyone We Know in Pasadena." Like, it was just, and everybody was just going in there to put like, name, address, or email address and phone number of just like literally everybody that maybe with the exception of people that we were sure wouldn't help us, kind of thing. But even in a few of those cases, I was like, I don't want to write them off until they tell me they're not going to help us. So it was the work of the tenants union is all done by volunteers, and it's not funded except by dues from our members. And we do perfectly fine in that capacity. But we have a hotline, which is like a cold line. It's like a Google Voice number, and an email address that gets a lot of traffic from tenants who are in crisis. And, we really struggle to emphasize that this is not a service organization. This is a organizing organization, this is a union. We do provide resources to tenants in need, but we try to get them then to join the union and join the struggle. A lot of people, take the resources and move on. That's their choice. But a lot of people have stayed and built the strength of the union. And it's the tenants union that really launched this campaign the second time as well, with a lot of help from a lot of other people. We're around 60% tenant household city, about 135,000 people, around 90 something thousand voters, and 60% are those are renter households. So it's definitely a majority. And but we also know that renters don't vote as frequently as homeowners, and so we've really worked hard to build our homeowner constituency as well. But there were many cases where crises that tenants were in came right as we were like in the fever pitch of the campaign, and we were like, we have to do both. Like, we can't let the tenant union just languish. We have a lingering LA County protection that disallows evictions, no fault evictions for major renovations until the end of the year. And we started getting calls from people that were getting no fault eviction notices for renovations. And it turned out that 1 building, 2 buildings, before long it was over 20 buildings, all by primarily from 2 management companies. And we helped the tenants write letters. We wrote letters ourselves as the tenants union. And the city attorney gave misleading information about whether the tenants were protected or not. And it was just a terrible thing. Eventually, these management companies rescinded these notices because they knew good and well that they were violating the law. But if we don't pass Measure H in 3 weeks, they'll be able to renew those renovictions on January 1st. So we try to build that in, right? Like, okay, you saved your housing for the next 3 months or 6 months or whatever. It was like July, so like 5 months. But if we don't pass Measure H, they're coming back for you. And not just you, but lots of other people. So please, join the campaign. That has some meager results. We had some people help us make videos. We had some people come out and canvas with us. We've gotten some endorsements from various people in the organizations they represent. But we've tried to maintain that organizing focus in the midst of this campaign. I was making turnout calls last night to turn people out to canvas on Saturday and Sunday, and called a woman who was in the middle of a huge crisis around an eviction. I ended up talking to her for 45 minutes and killed the rest of my turnout calls. But we're organizing with her now, and she's assisting us in the campaign, giving us some good ideas, and she's going to tell her church on Sunday about voting yes on Measure H. So, it's back and forth. You try to do the best you can. We have 2 part-time staff and 1 full-time staff. So we have 2 FTEs. Everyone else is volunteer. So it's just a big lift.
Thank you both. Yeah, I think that's the tension that I'm glad you're uplifting for folks who are considering it, because some people see themselves as tenant organizers and not as electoral ones, and others who are very used to running campaigns are newer to organizing tenants. So really appreciate you talking through that. This next question is really important to me because the 3 of us know exactly how difficult and draining and frustrating, but also gratifying campaign work can be. And in this call, we really want to encourage people to share that path with us, while also being fully informed of the challenges. So I'm going to frame this in more of a question. Can you tell us about, and I'm going to limit this to 2 since I know we could go on for hours about this. Tell us about 2 of the challenges in the ballot process, and knowing what you know now, what advice would you give others who are preparing for it? And for this one, we can start with Ryan.
I mean, most ballot initiative processes are designed for folks to fail for some, understandable reasons. They don't just want anybody to be able to put anything on the ballot whenever they want. It would be relatively chaotic, but at the same time, you know, they've made it such in California, at least, that you need paid signature gatherers to have a chance to gather all the signatures. So we had to do that as well. I would say, so I think just the massive lift. And, you know, it was funny, Tram and I were talking months ago. We just learned that we had qualified for the ballot. And, you know, in one of these like reality check moments, you said, you know, the next phase is going to be even harder. And I was like, no way. I might have included an expletive in there, you know. And it has been, it's differently hard, you know. It's like emotionally exhausting. And now, of course, with 3 weeks to go or 2.5 weeks to go, the opposition is just ramping up the lies and stuff. So we'll talk about that more later. But I would just say the massive, overwhelming lift. And I guess it's also one of the challenges is, I think that left organizations, and I would include myself in this, can be a little unwilling to play ball with people that aren't exactly where they're at on things. And, you know, in a campaign like this, you find yourself using like loopholes in tenant protections as reasons why homeowners should be comfortable with it. You know, like single family homes in California are exempt from rent control, just one example. So, you know, single family homeowner, if you were to one day rent this out, it wouldn't even affect you, you know, like, so you try to like share this in a way that's going to win votes. And that's been taxing, I would say, like on my psyche, you know, to just be building this coalition broadly, when in reality, it's intensely frustrating that a single family homeowner wouldn't support tenant protections just because it helps their neighbor, you know, even if it costs them a rental housing fee per year of like $150. Like they spend more going out to dinner with their family one day, you know, than that. So that's been hard, you know, just the compromises that you sometimes make for the greater good. And sometimes you don't. Sometimes there are compromises that go too far and you're just like, we don't need those votes. It's not worth trying to water something down so far that it's, you know, meaningless. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I want to uplift what Ryan said. That all resonated with me highly. It's kind of related to the massive lift, but I think just especially, again, we're coming at this from a volunteer, really a volunteer campaign. We've been able to make a couple of one real part-time hires and a couple of paid canvassers here in the final months. But other than that, it's been really a volunteer lift. So just the, you know, sustainability over the course of a campaign. There are a ton of folks who have come into the campaign and we wouldn't be here without them. Like literally there's some folks who think, look, we would not be at the ballot if it weren't for the efforts that you put in last year. But they're, you know, they're not involved anymore, just because of the level of effort and burnout that can come with the work. And that's where I kind of going back a little bit into the previous question, I just think organizations and movements need to take a look at sort of, you know, the arc of where they want their organization to be, where they want their base building to be. And you got to think in terms of multiple years down the road. It was a little tough for us in the moment. Now we're 2 years down the road, and weigh the pros and cons of, you know, taking on this effort and versus, you know, what other work you could do in that time. We just all have to take an honest accounting of where we're at and where we'd like to be. I think ultimately it was the right choice for us, but you know, we got really overwhelmed with the aspects of running the campaign to the point where our ideas for how we could do base building at the same time haven't we haven't been able to fully execute on a lot of those in terms of some of the deep canvassing we wanted to do, outreach, especially again, this whole, I think we've lifted it up, but our, as a, tenant focused work here, we want to reach tenants. And unfortunately that does not, that does not match on, what our government allows in terms of people who are allowed to vote. And I think that that has really sort of, in terms of some of the work, it's even more of a conservative influence than you would want, in terms of, hey, I'd rather be reaching out and deep canvassing with tenants than talking to homeowners, but in order to win this thing, I got to talk to homeowners right now. So just, yeah, these are all questions that we had kind of, I don't know, going through the experience, you experience it and learn about those tensions in a very different way. But I would definitely have those like serious conversations with folks that you're working with. Yeah, I think that's really the main one. The other one is, in terms of advice, yeah, do that outreach early, and do some of the fundraising early. I come from, again, my background and a lot of the initial volunteer group was from Democratic Socialists of America. We did not want to touch fundraising at the start, but you should touch fundraising if you're even during the signature gathering portion, like go start fundraising. It's and sometimes it is an awkward ask, but yeah, there's usually there are people with means who are willing to give to your campaign, and really in terms of making a winning effort, especially in a tough race. Obviously Ryan's got hundreds of thousands up against him. We have hundreds of thousands up against us now from the apartment association, etc. You got to bring a little bit of money to the table for these campaigns, and that's one added difficulty where we were learning how to fundraise as we went along. So I guess those are my two.
Thank you both. Yeah, fundraising. We could talk about that for ages. Right? Yeah, highly suggest. I echo what these two said with get started early with the money. And
I will say it's exciting though. It's like it almost becomes gamified, as we were logging on, I was just depositing another check in the bank, I'm like, yes, I got it, like I've been fighting for this one donation for 4 months, and it always comes in way later than you want it.
Yes.
We're getting donations, big donations now in October, and I'm like, thanks.
Yeah, you're like, how am I supposed to spend this now? I have a week turnaround.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that advice. I am sure everyone listening really appreciates kind of the reality check. So this came up a little bit in your, we talked about money and the opposition, but this next question is really focused on narrative, which I think, as a policy wonk myself, I don't think policy people pay enough attention to narrative. And just to kind of differentiate between comms and narrative, for me, comms is how you're spreading the word, but narrative is figuring out what the word is, right? And that really matters. How are we talking to people? What's the story we're telling? So we'll go to Mitch first for this question, but what are the key narratives that you're centering in your campaign? And then how are you, what messages have you had to combat from this opposition?
Yeah, this is definitely a complicated one and a really good one. Obviously, it's something we've been dealing with much more in the electoral phase of the work compared to signature gathering, was, we didn't really have to hone things in as much. But really, I'd say in terms of key messages we're centering, it's the one you see above my head in terms of keeping families housed. That goes to sort of the situation in Denver and walking this fine line. What's been on Denver voters' mind is just, the housing crisis here has really ballooned. It was terrible 10 years ago, and it's gotten even worse. And as part of that is homelessness. And often in Denver, that is done, the politics around homelessness, as it is in most of America, extremely reactionary and extremely troubling in terms of, there was one election where the national headlines in Denver were, Denver legalizes or decriminalizes magic mushrooms. And that was what got spread in the national media. And the really weird thing is, what else did Denver voters vote on that election? It was to prevent, to deny an overturn of the camping ban that we have in Denver, literally preventing people from having basic shelter when they're on the streets. That got rejected by Denver voters at like an 80-20 margin. So the politics of homelessness here are extremely fraught. But what we've been able to do, and a lot of our volunteers come from direct, they've done a lot of work around homelessness and working with organizations, especially ones that have membership base among unhoused people, and reframing that, like, what does right to counsel mean in terms of keeping people housed and preventing homelessness upstream before it happens. And that's been a real key thing for us in terms of making the connection between eviction and homelessness. We were shocked to find out. We were able to do some polling through help with the ACLU, who's been a great partner. And they were able, that polling found that Denverites weren't even making a connection between people getting kicked out of their homes and people ending up on the streets. So a big part of our campaign has been just educating folks about the consequences of eviction. And part of that is also, the racial and socioeconomic lens of eviction. Denver's eviction stats mirror the nationwide statistics, which is, Black and Latino populations are severely overrepresented in our eviction courts, disproportionate to the percentage population in the city. And then along with that, also there was a question in terms of work with disability rights groups, and yeah, that's about a third of the people facing eviction in Denver identify as having a disability, and us doing outreach to disability rights groups here in Denver and Colorado, especially the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition has been a key partner in some of our outreach efforts. So that's kind of the main one there in terms of our narrative. Obviously, we get, when depending on who we're talking to, we might get into discussions of how eviction court is rigged against tenants, and the realities of what the fact that when tenants have representation, they win. What does that mean about all these evictions that are happening with tenants who aren't represented? I mean, it means a lot of, frankly, like evictions that wouldn't stand up to scrutiny are happening in our city. So we push those narratives when, doing outreach to specific voters. But I guess in terms of our opposition, I mean, it's classic, the wolf's in the hen house, telling you that what you're trying to get the wolf out of the hen house, and they're saying this will be bad for the hens. It's kind of it, really. Our apartment association and friends, but pretty much most of the money's come from the apartment association against us. They're leaning into this narrative about the cost, and we have a fee element that's paid by the landlord, and would we have structured things differently in a perfect world? Yes, but the Colorado tax code is extremely progressive, hard coded in our constitution like 30 years ago, to prevent us from doing things like, even graduated taxes or typical sort of policy solutions that would have, tax the rich to fund necessary social services. So a big thing they're leaning into is, oh, well, this cost is just going to make housing costs in Denver go up, and it's going to make our housing situation go even more. And for us, our counter has been, especially as we're talking to tenants on the door and doing some inoculation, is putting things in perspective of scale. Is our fee comes out to $6 a month per unit that the landlord will have to pay. And the average rent increase in Denver last year was $222 a month. So we are talking about what is a nominal fee for a critical service compared to just this current state of, I mean, that's just 1 year of a rent increase. I mean, rent prices here have doubled in the last 10 years, and I'm sure it has in pretty much everyone who's on this call. I'm pretty sure their cities as well. So I'll leave it there. Yeah, those are kind of just a quick run through of the narratives.
Thanks, Mitch. How about Pasadena?
Yeah. So we lead with rent control, and sometimes we've had some of the our political allies in the city encourage us to go with rent stabilization. We claim that it means the same thing. But when we polled in the beginning of our campaign, we found that rent control is really popular. And eviction protections are like really popular. Like it strikes most people as really unjust to be evicted from your apartment without a reason. And so we've really just gone with that narrative, of like rents are rising at 10%. There's a state anti-rent gouging law in California, which is related to the CPI. It's 5% plus CPI, or 10%, whichever's less. When they, we fought them on that 10% thing. I'm so glad it stayed there, because it would be like 13% if it was just 5% plus CPI. So, I think most people are responsive to the idea that a 10% housing cost increase is unsustainable. Like if your mortgage, for those of people that have a mortgage, went up by 10%, that's pretty hard for most people to bear. And we've also emphasized the race component of housing injustice in Pasadena. There's some unique dynamics here in Pasadena. There's a community in the northwest of the city that's been a historically Black and brown community, Black long before it had like a Latino community even, going back to the Great Migration, and then post-war. And then freeways were put in the 70s and put right through the middle of the Black community, uprooting churches, businesses, homes, historic sites. And so, we keep emphasizing that, it's been tough, on top of it, the NAACP had, the president of the NAACP signed the ballot statement in opposition to our measure. So that, that's been a tough thing for us to navigate. They've used a narrative of race as well, that rent control limits Black families' ability to accrue wealth. And they've been historically cut out of the real estate market, and which of course is true and something we're trying to address as well. But they've framed rent control as a further limit on Black folks being able to build wealth through real estate. So yeah, I'm not sure how much that resonates with folks, but it certainly resonates with some people. We also have a homelessness crisis that's very famous in California. We are very fortunate to have gotten the endorsement of our homeless services agency here in Pasadena. Those types of agencies are often quite cautious. There's several board members that are, bank vice presidents and things like that, like a very established nonprofit. But they've gone ahead and endorsed us, and their CEO called our measure homelessness prevention. And she's a very, very well-respected leader in the community. So that's been really key part of the story. We know from our homeless count that a majority of folks that are unhoused in Pasadena were formerly housed in Pasadena, meaning that they were priced out. And when you ask folks, what is the primary cause of your not having a home right now, they will say economic reasons. It's weird because on the survey, it's like economic reasons, eviction, or like a rent increase, which in my mind is an economic reason. So you have to kind of combine those things, and it's overwhelmingly economic reasons. So those have been, I mean, the narrative on the other side is just so old and tired. I don't even want to bore people with it. It's basically rent control doesn't work. They never say work for who or for what. It's just, it's like saying, you know, my shirt is 10%. Right? Like 10% of what? You know, they don't have any answer for that question. They say that it's going to reduce the quality of the housing stock. They say that it's going to compel owners to turn their units into condos. I was in a debate earlier today on Zoom with the president of the Chamber of Commerce, and he said all of these things. And I said, you know, it's not the rent control measure that converts, you know, units to condos. It's landlords who convert units to condos. So I think every argument that you bring up against rent control is basically an admission that landlords are horrible people. Like, you just admit, like, they're just going to raise the rents even more. Okay, so they, you know, they're just going to be retributive, you know, against tenants. And it's just, you know, just very frustrating. But I also think they don't have any clever responses. In their flyers, they've never even mentioned rent control once in the mailers that they mail out. They talk about the rent board being unaccountable. Basically, if you take them at their word, like, our rent board could declare war on another neighboring city. You know, there's like total, you know, absolute power to do anything we want to do. And I'm starting to get really excited about this rent board, you know, all the power we're going to have. So yeah, I think, you know, their narrative has been pretty easy to combat. And it's the typical conservative approach where they just lie and then repeat the lie, like over and over and over and over and over and over again, until people start to go, you know, maybe that's the case. So we're just really staying on message. We know that tenants, you know, we can't even get through our script with tenants when we're at the door. We're like, so, you know, I'm a volunteer with the Measure H campaign. Oh yeah, I'm voting yes on that. Absolutely. My rent just went up. I'm voting yes on that. I'm like, okay, well, do you want the flyer? Here's a flyer with the website. No, it's fine. That's all right. I already voted. We're voting yes on that. So it's just so easy to convince tenants if they'll only just go out and vote. That'll be the key thing.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to go to our last question, which relates to what you were just saying, Ryan, about how easy it is to get some people to vote yes. There's not much of a case to be made, right, when you have the lived experience of seeing your rent go up. So I want to make sure that we and our panel, before going into Q&A, hearing about the uplifting parts of the campaign. So we're going to end with this question. Describe this political moment for both Denver and Pasadena. What wins are you seeing day to day as you are building this movement that kind of, you know, give you the motivation and encourage you and tell you that, like, this is the right thing to do? So who did we start with last time? Let's start with Ryan this time. I think we started with Mitch. Okay.
That's right. Yeah, well, I'll start with, you know, as the finance coordinator, you know, seeing donations come in from tenants. You know, sometimes I know the person, most of the time I don't. You know, in the beginning, all the donations were from people I knew. And then when it started to be like this flood of donations from people I'd never met, I was like, wow, the campaign is really getting out there. It's touching people that none of us in the core team actually know personally. And they're giving $10, $20, like, it's not a lot, but it's, and you can see in their address, apartment such and such, you know, and they're from Pasadena. And that's really inspiring, you know, watching volunteers come out. They've never knocked on a stranger's door in their life, maybe when they sold Girl Scout cookies way back when, but they've never been in a political campaign of any kind before. And to see them on the phones, which I actually think the phones are more intimidating than the doors. Like, I think there's like a cultural norm for like knocking on someone's door, but calling a random stranger, you know, in the evening, and, you know, it just, people are more aggressive when you call them on the phone than when you knock on their door, I find, you know, at least in our experience. And people are just toughing it out. We have this one high school student who, you know, phone banks with us every Wednesday. You know, he's like a sophomore and he could like argue circles around most people I know. He's so smart. And yeah, and just seeing the endorsements come in has been really inspiring. One of my most proud endorsements, besides the Union Station Homeless Services, is Abundant Housing LA, which is our local YIMBY organization. So they're very like pro-development, let's build more housing, and they don't really support rent control typically, but they endorsed our campaign. And so it enables us to go out to people who are like, rent control is not the answer, building more housing is the answer. And we're able to say, yes, we agree with both of those things. And here's the Abundant Housing endorsement to prove it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess just to tie this into the broader movement, I mean, the moment here in Denver, I just got to ground it. It's one of urgency. You know, talking to one of the organizations that I kind of work with, somewhat related to the campaign, but other housing work. They identified, you know, the main problem they have right now with their membership, which is largely Latino in suburbs of Denver, is just, I mean, people are getting priced out of our state and leaving at a really high rate. Like the displacement, obviously I know California same too, but the displacement in Colorado has just been really, you know, where a lot of these organizations doing this work here are holding the pain of like people and communities that have been displaced. So, you know, I talked to a tenant last night that had a $330 rent increase at an apartment complex, which I just read earlier today is being slated for redevelopment into luxury condos. So not only are they getting this rent increase this year, they're likely going to get kicked out next year. So it's this moment of, I mean, it's just a moment of real urgency, but it is also a moment where that urgency has created like tenants are coming together and identifying politically as tenants for at least like the first time in a large scale way in Colorado for the first time in quite a while. And we're seeing wins. We've passed some much improved renter protections, cutting off some loopholes and exploitation in the eviction process at the state level. And again, more protections for mobile home park residents who have been just really exploited, kind of the worst of both worlds in terms of that weird legal line of kind of being a homeowner, but really when you don't own the land underneath the home, you're not. But yeah, it's a growing movement and one where, you know, again, like talking about the popularity of rent control, I think rent control is polling at around 70% statewide among all Coloradans. So it is this moment where, you know, unfortunately it's born out of these dire conditions, but it's one where people are starting to come together in a pretty like, you know, in a way that we haven't seen at least this type of momentum in a while. There will still be challenges. Our governor is completely opposed to rent control. He's you know, he's a very popular Democrat, especially among like the national media circuits, but you know, he is a almost like the ideal, what libertarians think of themselves in terms of socially liberal and fiscally conservative. He is, so, you know, we're dealing with those sorts of political realities where it's like, okay, 4 more years of getting vetoes if we try to repeal our statewide prohibition on rent control. So there are some immense challenges, but also again, some real, like again, I posted in the chat, we had, I think it was like the first anti-gentrification protest I can remember since I moved out here. 4 different languages being spoken at the rally among, you know, some of Denver's hardest hit communities by gentrification. But again, seeing just beautiful, I think they said their rallying cry at the rally was many languages, one voice. And that was just, it was incredibly powerful to be there. And that's one of the groups we've worked with starting through this campaign that we'll look to continue our work with. So, you know, it's moments like that and seeing that power of people standing together that keeps the fight going.
Thank you both so much. So we're going to transition into about 10 minutes of Q&A, and thanks to my colleagues who have been answering some questions in the chat. I know there's some that have not been answered. So we're going to start with Sally's question. And Mitch, Ryan, feel free to just unmute and answer if you feel like it. So have you reached out to the differently abled community and elder organizations? Has that been useful since they're usually reliable voters?
I'm happy to go here, and I guess just as a quick note, most of the community groups out here in Colorado do use the terminology of disabled, like Colorado Cross Disability Coalition. So I just want to highlight that, and I'll use that terminology. But we have reached out to a number of them. Colorado Cross Disability Coalition being the major one, and you know, in terms of reliable voters, I mean, that hasn't really been that wasn't really our calculus necessarily, and you know, they are as a group, these organizations are incredibly politically active, and they've contributed phone bankers to our campaign. Really, it was an important thing in terms of our values of, especially recently with the phone banks and providing ways for volunteers to plug into our campaign, you know, despite you know, differences in ability, and being able to you know, providing an accessible campaign for folks to advance the work. So you know, they've been a great group to work with and incredibly politically active. So a happy partnership to build.
We're having like a very stable population, people that have lived here all their lives. So we have a fairly large elder population. Many of them are very well to do. We have had good luck phoning. People that we know from the voter file are seniors, and you know, they're often at home. You can reach them. They're happy to talk usually. And there's a story out today from the LAist that includes an interview with a woman who lives on a fixed income as an elder. And so we tried to get the AARP's endorsement and to work with them, but they declined to get involved, unfortunately. But we did make an effort at that. One of our volunteers works for the AARP.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. So in St. Paul, we had a faith-based organization called Isaiah that mobilized a lot of their like seniors who belong to a lot of church congregations to do door knocking in their neighborhoods. And I think that the thing with door knocking is really like choosing the right messenger, right? Like if you're in a renter heavy community, then it's great to have renters talking to renters. If you're in like a predominantly whiter, wealthier, homeowner-y neighborhood, then like you send the right messengers, not only for the safety of your canvassers, but for like a better conversation. So that's kind of how it happened in St. Paul. We'll go to the next question from Kristen, which is, given the current climate, do you encounter barriers related to misinformation or disinformation and voter suppression? How do you address it? And are there partners or resources that you found helpful to support you? So focused on barriers related to misinformation and voter suppression.
I wouldn't say I've encountered voter suppression efforts. You know, there was a time where Pasadena was a predominantly conservative district or city rather. There was famously a very large chapter of the John Birch Society in Pasadena, and Pasadena is also famously the only city outside of the Deep South that was forced to desegregate their schools by the federal courts. So you know, there have been like strong efforts to block, and it's a very business friendly city. I think it's just the lies that the landlords say. Like they've literally said that our measure will take money away from fire department and parks and essential city services. It's, you know, that could not be more just plainly not true and totally made up out of whole cloth. And then people latch onto that kind of thing. And there's no mechanism to hold anyone accountable for lying. Our Fair Political Practices Commission focuses on financing campaigns and making sure that that's transparent, which is great as far as that goes. But there's no mechanism for holding anyone accountable for just printing absolute lies and mailing it to everybody in the mail.
Yeah, it's sort of somewhat similar situation. And in Colorado, we are not dealing as much of an issue in terms of direct voter suppression. I just shout out a solidarity to the person here from Florida in terms of, I mean, there's nothing that makes my blood boil more than what DeSantis has been doing in terms of jailing people who have had their right to vote restored. You know, thankfully we have a vote by mail system, which also makes the our campaign timeline weird, right? Because ballots have already gone out. People are already returning their ballots. So instead of waiting for like November, we've been in like get out the vote for a while now. But in terms of misinformation, we do kind of have a similar landscape where like we have a booklet that gets sent out, and that sort of information can be, it's not edited. So, I mean, in terms of statements from the apartment association, et cetera, like, you know, I think one thing on the media side has been that we've been frustrated with is we'll go, you know, they'll come to us for a quote and then they'll go to the apartment association and there's no rebuttal given. It's just, you know, they've kind of been gotten the last word in a lot of pieces, even when they say patently false things like, we're setting up a fund for tenants to sue their lawyers. It's like the only person suing in this case is the landlord suing for an eviction. I mean, patently false things that have gotten just no, you know, in this view of objectivity, that's actually some from journalism that's sometimes gotten in the way of, you know, truth and matter of facts. I think the recent coverage has been really good, but again, and I guess the final point is they've got a lot more money than we do right now. So in terms of misinformation that's going to get passed around to voters in the last final weeks, it's going to be coming. And, you know, what we've been doing is just trying to have conversations on the doors, because we know that's something that they're not doing. They are not doing, you know, they're going digital, they're going, maybe they'll send out a mailer, but, you know, we are the ones having one-to-one conversations to answer people's concerns and, you know, hopefully change some minds.
In that vein, I'm really proud of this piece. Oh, can you see it?
Oh, nice.
On his shoulder, it says corporate landlords. I don't, the screen sharing.
This background is
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. So we have 4 minutes left. I want to touch on one more question. I'm actually going to hog this spotlight to answer this one, because I think we kind of dealt with it in St. Paul. So I saw a little bit in the chat about, you know, how we get like lower income landlords who often provide NOAA, or how we get landlords developers in on this. So what we really did with our narrative in St. Paul was not make it a renter versus landlord issue, but in our narrative, make it a people who care about St. Paul versus people who want to extract wealth from St. Paul issue, right? So our villain was never landlord. I mean, regardless of what we believed personally, in the campaign messaging, the villain was corporate predatory landlords, the private equity firms that we know are swooping in and buying up properties and treating tenants poorly in our communities. And so we were able to create a lot of unity across St. Paulites, regardless of whether they were renters, homeowners, or small landlords, because I think everyone, you know, is starting to see that rise in the power of like consolidating corporate landlords, right? And so the picture that we painted wasn't renter landlord, it was St. Paul versus the world, kind of, right? St. Paul versus the forces that are ruining our housing system. So I hope that can help a little bit in how you think about engaging people across the city in housing issues. And then I would say, find a handful of landlords who support the issue. They're out there, right? They're out there, and the power of storytelling is that once you have one example, people will remember that, right? They're gonna remember, oh yeah, there's that landlord I saw in that mailer. Martine, who is here on the panel, was our landlord, right? And he was out there saying, I support rent stabilization. It makes sense for me. I'm out here trying to run my business, and I am actually I have more in common with my neighbor, regardless of whether they're a renter or homeowner, than I do with the corporate entities. And so with that, I want to share my deep gratitude and appreciation for our panelists. So please share your applause and appreciation in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us, especially to our friends on the East Coast and Central time zones who are staying up a little bit later. Before I close, I want to uplift two things. So one, please check out the ballot initiative resource that PolicyLink created. There's going to be a link to that in the chat. And then two, please take a moment to let us know what you want more of, what helped from today's conversation, in building your capacity to run your own campaign. So please take our evaluation survey and tell us what you liked, what you want to hear more about. So with that, let us send some affirmations and solidarity to Ryan and Mitch in the chat as we head out. We want to let them know that renters and allies across the country will be thinking of them on election night. We're going to be cheering them on. I know it feels hard, but people across the country are really looking to your leadership and all the hard work that you're doing. So once everyone here on this call launches their own campaigns, you will get to be up here with me on this panel, and hopefully Ryan and Mitch will get to enjoy a beverage of their choice while watching you. So have a great evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Ryan and Mitch. And
thank
don't
you,
forget
Tram.
to vote.
Thank you for being an excellent host.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tram, and thanks to everyone from PolicyLink.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Don't forget to vote by November 8th.
Don't forget to vote.
Gotta end with that.
This is the group that's least likely to forget to vote.
Exactly. Thanks, everyone.